On March 5th, 1770, a man of African and Wampanoag heritage was crunching through a couple of inches of snow in downtown Boston, approaching a commotion. It was already dark and just as cold as every prior Boston spring. But nearing the age of 50 and having served on whaling ships for almost 20 years at this point, he was as strong in his character as in his resolve. So these chilly evenings were of no avail to his mission currently. It wasn't long before the sailor came upon a swath of people berating soldiers who were then deployed to keep the peace. He joined in the social disturbance that was quickly becoming problematic for the local authorities to contain. You see, a new tax had been implemented, and the citizens of the city were rightfully infuriated at all the other recent ill treatment they had gone through, not to mention the tariffs that had also been imposed through the Townsend Act. The residents of Boston saw many of these as unlawful, and they even contended that it went against the established rights that were already bestowed to them upon the King of England himself. Now, at first, the rabble-rousers threw only snow and insults at the 9 guardsmen, but it wasn't until one or a few of those snowballs actually contained rocks and other, refuse that the tensions began to rise. The soldiers were having difficulty maintaining order as the sea of people and their steady ebb and flow of unrest was clearly more than any of them could endure. The situation went south. Eventually, the sailor found himself with a group of other men who had armed themselves with clubs and batons and charged to the front of the mass of humans that were now surrounding the old state house. And while accounts vary, some say the sailor of mixed ethnicity struck one of the 9 soldiers, while others just report that he had been there holding some kind of stick. What can be agreed upon, though, is the next few seconds changed the course of human history forever. Against the orders of the leadership in charge of the 9 soldiers, shots began to ring out, smoke billowed from the firearms of the guards, and bullets sailed into the crowd, 2 of which ricocheted into the sailor's chest, one mutilating the man's liver and the other puncturing his right lung. When the chaos dissolved, 5 bodies lay dead on the ground while 6 more were desperately tending to their wounds. The first of whom was a sailor, a black man by the name of Crispus Attucks, who had officially become the first recorded casualty in the War for Independence for the United States of America. Salutations, nerds, and today is November 22nd, 2024, and it's also the 3rd installment of the miniseries Black History is American History, and I hope you're in for a long one because the stories of Black Americans during the Revolutionary War and the fight for our nation's freedom is nothing less than harrowing. Keep in mind, all of these individuals still faced the onslaught of discrimination and prejudice throughout, so if you enjoy this and other American content, be sure to like, subscribe, and share, and maybe together we can all shine new lights on old subjects and help future generations never forget the atrocities of the past. Crispus Attucks was the first, but he would not be the last Black American to fight and spill their blood in the face of insurmountable odds, as the fledgling nation was still under British rule and dramatically outgunned against the might of both the Royal Navy and the ground forces of the time. His body was buried on March 8th after having laid in state. He was interred alongside the bodies of the other men in the Granary Burying Ground after what would forever be remembered as the Boston Massacre. There, the men remain alongside the likes of Paul Revere, Robert Payne, Samuel Adams, and John Hancock. 5 years later, in a town about 20 miles northwest of Boston, cold, windy morning, just before the sun began to rise, a cadence of drums began to play. The militia of Lexington began marching under the leadership of Captain John Parker. Among them were both free and enslaved African Americans at the precipice of the first major military campaign for the freedom of our country, one of whom by the name of Private Prince Estabrook, a slave of a man by the name of Benjamin Estabrook. The two were said to have actually had a positive relationship, and Benjamin would often be found working right alongside Prince throughout the duties that he was responsible for. As he and 76 other members of his Minutemen militia stood ready, they were eventually facing a force of approximately 700 disciplined soldiers of the most formidable fighting force in the world. Not long into the initial moments of the day, a round was fired, enshrining what would be forever known as the shot heard round the world, as described in Ralph Waldo Emerson's poem, The Conquered Hymn. The ensuing battle left Prince Estabrook and 8 others injured, while 8 lay dead. He had been shot in the shoulder, although he would make a full recovery and return to the service shortly thereafter, to also take part in the Battle of Bunker Hill as a member of the new Continental Army. From there, he was sent to New York to be stationed at Fort Ticonderoga. Prince eventually made it back home to Lexington after the war, where he met up with Benjamin Estabrook again, but as an emancipated man and as a friend. They remained together and close friends well after his freedom was granted. Another brave African-American who fought alongside Prince Estabrook in Lexington was a gentleman by the name of Salem Poor, who was born a slave. Although he was eventually able to purchase his own freedom, not only did he actually create the defensive fortifications and positions at Bunker Hill, he also fought bravely alongside his fellow patriots, which began with a volley of cannonballs from the British naval ship, the HMS Lively. Unfortunately, none of the cannonballs made their mark as the cast iron sphere tumbled to the earth at the base of the hill. At this point, the British decided to move in with a force of infantry, Marines, and Grenadiers. This force would face a hell of a fight, climbing over their dead comrades before finally breaking through the lines. The brave men at Bunker Hill then engaged in hand-to-hand combat, while bayonets and sabers swung wildly. Although they took great losses while retreating from the unforgettably gruesome combat, Salem Poor not only managed to make it home, but was commended in a letter written to the General Court of Massachusetts to recognize his ferocity and courage in that battle. One of the 14 signatories of that letter being Colonel William Prescott, meaning Poor was very likely within earshot when he ordered the troops not to fire upon the enemy until you see the whites of their eyes. Salem Poor went on to fight in other revolutionary campaigns, such as the Battle of Saratoga. He was discharged on March 20th, 1780. He eventually made it to Boston, had 4 wives, and passed away in 1802 at the age of 55, where he was buried in Copp's Hill burying ground. Now that we've covered some of the badassery of our fellow Americans in our nation's fight for freedom, let's discover the less than ideal historical moments of the otherwise angelic forefathers. Slave owner and commander of the Continental Army, George Super Honest Guy Washington, made an explicit order that was disseminated through the ranks not to allow African Americans to serve in the military. And in light of this, the British made it known that if any slaves chose to fight on their side, they would be granted their freedom. According to historical records, that was a pretty good deal because around 20,000 slaves were motivated to escape their bounds and become what was later called Black Loyalists. Damn it, George! Later, seeing the error in his decision, Washington later reversed this order and eventually permitted their recruitment. Thanks, George! This proved influential in bolstering the military's numbers on all fronts, and eventually black and white integrated regiments were fighting and sacrificing throughout the entirety of the war. And finally, south into Virginia. On October 9th, 1781, a man by the name of James Armistead Lafayette stepped into view of George Washington, who was now standing in front of a cannon, and he watched as the leader of the Continental Army fire the first official round into the Battle of Yorktown. Before this, Lafayette acted as a double agent for the United States, posing as a slave who had sought freedom as a black loyalist, where he was employed by Benedict Arnold. In this capacity, he was able to provide crucial information that provided mountains of intel regarding British troop movements. And as Lafayette stood strong while countless rounds flew through the sky, peppering the evening air with cracks and pops, he also took catharsis in knowing that he had also passed on information to Washington and his generals about reinforcements that were moving in against them. Because of this, they were able to form a blockade with which to counter the British reinforcements and thwarted the secret attack that the Redcoats hoped would turn the tide. Lieutenant General Cornwallis surrendered on October 19th, 1781 to General George Washington, ending the war and kickstarting the greatest experiment ever told, the United States. Unfortunately, Lafayette returned to slavery until 1787, where he was finally awarded his freedom after arguably some of the most incredible acts of the war. He passed away in Virginia in 1830 at the age of 82. At this juncture, a new republic was laid bare. And although slavery remained a huge black eye on our nation's history from the Revolutionary War to the end of the Civil War in the 1860s, Black Americans still had a story to tell. From the very conception of the United States Constitution, through the gold rush and push westward into a wild and dangerous frontier, Black men and women were still just getting started in weaving their own storied place into our nation's history. And I hope you'll join me in exploring these new horizons. Hey, I unfortunately need to make a correction. In the previous video, I made mention to the Battle of Lexington and Concord as being a warm, bright day. And in this one, I correctly mentioned that it was actually cold and windy. And this may seem unnecessary to a lot of viewers, but I strive to make sure that my information is accurate, and I always want to make sure that if I do happen to make a mistake, I own up to it, because that's how we all learn and we grow. So, until next time, stay decent, nerds.